Hello, I am Bob the McCrea and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to really focus on basically my TBR for the kind of coming year. TBRs are always the thing, right? Where it's sort of like, I'll add it to the TBR, and it's kind of like a sort of an endless mental tab that just kind of keeps on being reopened and sort of like, okay, right, cool, that's also going to go on the TBR, great. And eventually you never really get through it because firstly, so many great books come out all the time. So even if it's just like new releases, your TBR never really shrinks because there are all these new books coming out. And that's not to mention like the thousands of years of literature before where a lot of other really good things have been written and published and everything. So mine's a little bit out of hand, but I'm sort of generally okay at sort of chipping away at bits of it, but in very specific ways of like, right, now I'm going to focus on all books by this author or whatever. That said, Kieran over at KD Books has sort of come up with a good solution for at least making some headway on on your TBR, and here is sort of my attempt. So he basically has been encouraging people to create their stack of 12 books for over the year, and particularly 12 books, taking one roughly per month, where Kieran will then be sort of sending out prompts to encourage you to go and read them. And so that might be a way to kind of just give a little bit of a nudge. Now, I feel like in some ways I've played my own hand, played myself, I guess would be the phrase. I've played myself terribly here because I've chosen quite a few chunky ones, and you may have sort of seen from the thumbnail, but here are the books that I'm wanting to have on my TBR, and I'm going to quickly go through them now just for ease, and you'll sort of see some themes, but also just generally here are books that I've been meaning to get to for a little bit. Let's try that for this year. I mean, I'd say this alongside saying like, I'm going to read every prize and I'm going to do all these other things. What's going to happen, Bob? I'm not going to sleep. That's just going to eat a lot of chocolate. There we go. First up, I really want to read The Bell by Iris Murdoch. So, as you may know, I read quite a bit of Iris Murdoch last year. I read her 6 Booker shortlisted books from over the years and really, really loved them, particularly The Sea and The Black Prince, which I just thought were incredible. And I received this as a gift from my housemate when I was at uni, so like 10 years ago. I'm still friends with her, and I'm still occasionally like, I'm gonna read it one day. So I feel like this should be the year that I do this, particularly coming off the back of reading a few more Iris Murdoch books. But also, yeah, Iris Murdoch, I've not read anything not Booker shortlisted by her, and it would be nice as a change to sort of realise that, that from her 27 or whatever novel back catalogue, there might be some other books that are worthwhile apart from those other 6. So The Bell, it just sort of sounds like a really interesting one of like a family with religion and bits of magic and other things kind of going on. So this sounds quite fun, and it's relatively short compared to at least some of the other ones on this sort of pile, and you'll see those in just a moment. 2 of the other ones that I put on here were quite connected, but I've been kind of meaning to read for a little bit. The first being The Meme Machine by Susan Blackmore, which is a non-fiction book, but just sort of talking about sort of Richard Dawkins' ideas of memes and kind of the kind of creation of them. So not necessarily in the internet way we necessarily think of them now, but kind of that initial stage. And this is sort of a background to then thinking about how memes have started becoming a thing on the internet. You may know from some of the videos I've put out before, particularly when I was talking about Patricia Lockwood's No One Is Talking About This. I bring this story up far too often, but I'm getting my money's worth after paying to do this master's. I did a master's in linguistics, and I wrote an essay at one point about doggo memes, which if you don't know about them, don't Google it. I mean, it's safe for work, but it's a bit of a weird rabbit hole, and I was really fascinated by how the language of doggo memes sort of became its own thing. Anyway, so this book, for that reason, fascinates me, as does this book that I've had for a few years and I've been really, really meaning to read, Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch, who has a really amazing podcast called Lingthusiasm, where she talks about linguistic stuff. And she sort of basically delves into a lot of ideas around how internet language and internet culture sort of generates and particularly how those linguistic things that we see as sort of that some people would just say, well, it's bad English or whatever, have a kind of a real linguistic structure to them that is actually a kind of a really, you know, solid and legitimate use of language, hence the title, Because Internet. With, I mean, it's still sort of used now, but hence, you know, that sort of trend at one point for kind of people to kind of create what would seem ungrammatical sentences with things like, you know, why do I do it? Because lols, or like, because gravy. I don't know why anyone would say that one actually, but you get what I mean. And so that's kind of part of the list. And I also thought it would be a fun non-fiction book to add to a list of what might otherwise be some quite chunky books. A couple of these next ones I've spoken about before that I've been really meaning to read for a while. One of them is Daryl by Jackie Ess, and Gunpowder Fiction and Plot really highly spoke about this book ages ago, and I bought it then and then have not touched it. I will, and it's short, so I have no excuse. But I really want to read this year, which just sounds like this very kind of queer and bizarre story that involves like cuckolding and some other things. It sounds like a wonderful mess. It has Tori Peters, the author of Detransition Baby, giving a little thing at the top saying about how amazing it is. So, you know, I'm sold anyway. And likewise, Panenka by Ronan Hession. Sean, the book maniac, had a really good interview with the author. And this book just sounds so fascinating. It's up my street in terms of a family drama. It's Irish. This is basically everything I love. And I really wanted to read this in time, you know, in 2021, because I had a sort of suspicion that it might end up being one of my top books of the year. I kind of just ran out of time, but I'm really keen to finally read this. Next were a couple of books that I also spoke about in a previous one, and these are where the chunky ones start to come in. The first being Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. If people want to buddy read this one with me, please, by the way, let me know, because it is a chunker, and I think I also will probably want to discuss it as it goes. But it's a, you know, it's about 1,000 pages long, by the, you know, the author of Piranesi. And so I loved Piranesi so much that I'm really keen to go back and check this out. But it's a big one, and I think I said this last time I mentioned the book on here, but this sort of 3 for 2 Waterstone sticker has been on it since I bought it. I obviously haven't added it since, but you know, like I bought this book basically not long after it came out in paperback, and that is a very long time ago, and I have not touched it. And it's kind of the back, I'm not sure if you can see colour difference wise, from just sort of sun bleaching from being on my shelf for too long, has sort of turned a bit grey, so there we go. And another one, also with Gunpowder Fiction and Plot sort of in mind, is Rohinton Mysteries, A Fine Balance, which is about sort of 600 pages or so, and shortlist for the Booker. So at least I can kind of tick it off in that sense as well. But this book has just, I've heard amazing things from, and from quite a broad range of people. You know, often books that are this long really have to earn that sort of length, and it sounds like from what people have said that it kind of has, because it's sort of a really funny and really heartwarming and dark story in many ways. So I'm really excited to check this out too. The next couple are also ones that I really didn't get to in 2021, despite sort of wanting to. Cold New Climate by Isobel Wohl, which is by the sort of the independent press, Weather Glass Books, who I'm really keen to just read things from anyway. They just sound really exciting, particularly as part of their background for setting up the publishing house was that they were thinking about the Penelope Fitzgerald book, The Blue Flower, which I really loved, and they were saying how a book like that wouldn't necessarily be able to find a publisher nowadays, and so they set up their own to champion books like it. And so I really want to read this, and I kind of, it just sounds fascinating with a lot of parts of stories about a kind of dark story. It's kind of a love story, it's kind of a bit of everything. Really keen to read this. And then a non-fiction one that I kept meaning to read last year, is kind of a bit difficult to see there, but The Deviance War, and this is by Eric Cervini, and it is basically a sort of history of queer rights, particularly in the US, and how particularly sort of fighting eras of sort of things like McCarthyism and other things to have kind of queer rights seen as a normal part of life, as opposed to a sort of a threat to the fabric of America, which is sort of how it was felt at sort of various points, particularly under the McCarthy era. So I'm really keen to finally read this. And the author himself is just a really interesting person, just in terms of the sort of areas he focuses on with his research as well. So yeah, really keen to finally read this. And then there is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, which the wonderful Larry Has Opinions loved and spoke about in a great video on it, and then also bought me a copy, and I need to finally read this. And I think, if nothing else, it's also just going to be interesting for me to read slightly more outside of my sort of comfort zone, I guess, for want of a better word. So yeah, really, really keen to check this out. And the last two are connected to a friend of mine who is a wonderful, voracious reader, but also who we kind of, particularly pre-lockdown, it was a sort of case of I would lend him a couple of books, he'd lend me a couple. He was much better at getting them back to me than I am kind of giving them back to him, as we'll see with this. So one of these, I mean, I say giving this back, in this case this was a gift, but this is An Arrow's Flight by Mark Merlis, and it's kind of interesting. This is giant, but the print is fairly big, but essentially it talks about yeah, it's kind of an interesting idea, kind of bringing in ideas around kind of Greek things, but also it's a kind of an AIDS memoir and a few other things as well. So I'm really, really keen to check this out. It sounds beautiful. It sounds completely like a kind of gorgeous sort of lyrical book, and I'm just very, very keen to finally read it. And that brings us on finally to the book that I will be reading in January, or attempting to, which is Gavin McCrea's Mrs. Engels. And this is a book that comes highly recommended from that friend, also from Eric Carl Anderson over at Lonesome Reader. And I realise it's almost becoming an ongoing joke now, because I think in like September or maybe earlier last year, I'm like, yes, I'm definitely going to read it now. It's on my list. I'm going to read it. Have not read it yet, you know. But I think it just sounds like such a fascinating history, and a kind of a really interesting sort of look into the inner lives of women, particularly sort of women involved in a kind of big historical moment, but kind of a little bit more on the sidelines, in the case of Mrs. Engels. So anyway, those are the 12 books I'm really hoping to get through this year, on top of everything else. Wish me luck. But we shall see. But I'd love to hear from you as well. What kind of books are you planning on reading this year? Have you got any books that have been on your TBR for a really long time and have not been going anywhere? This might be a good way to kind of have it as a mini resolution. And again, obviously no pressure. Like, you can put them on the list and maybe only read 3 of them. I mean, that does seem to defeat the purpose of the activity, but it is also, you know, reading is meant to be for pleasure. So please don't feel like you have to force yourself. This is also me sending myself a message that as I go back and edit this, I'll see that and be like, oh yeah, maybe I should be a bit nicer to myself in terms of reading. But nonetheless, I hope your reading is going really well this year. And I hope you have a great year. Let me know what's on your list, and take care. I've been Bob the McCrea. Bye bye.